The Compromise of 1877, the conflict between the North and the South. In 1876, the United States was in the middle of Reconstruction. The election was corrupt, and they needed to come up with a solution, so they came up with the Compromise of 1877. The conflict between the North and the South led the presidency to investigations on the election, which ended the Reconstruction era. Before the election, the Compromise of 1877 was a compromise designed to end the controversy that surrounded the election of 1876. The election of 1876 stands out as one of the most controversial and close elections in the history of America, as the election ultimately came down to Rutherford B. Hayes, the Republican candidate, with 165 electoral votes, and Samuel J. Tilden, the Democratic candidate, with 184 electoral votes. President Abraham Lincoln had begun the process of reconstructing the seceded states, bringing them back to the United States during the Civil War. His ideas on Reconstruction were still evolving when he was assassinated in April of 1865. His successor, Andrew Johnson, did not have the political skills to work with Congress to resolve the daunting trials facing the nation. Despite his strong support for the North, Johnson allowed former Confederates to regain control over Southern state governments and quickly became embroiled in a bitter struggle with congressional Republicans who did not want to lose their peace. By the 1870s, support was waiting for the racial tensions of Reconstruction, as many Southern whites had resorted to intimidation and violence to keep the blacks from voting. Beginning in 1873, a series of Supreme Court decisions limited the scope of Reconstruction-era laws, particularly the 14th and 15th Amendment, which gave African Americans citizenship and the right to vote for the very first time. The election. Southern Democrats who stayed home in 1872 flooded the polls in 1876. The Democrats also increased their total number of votes in the North, particularly the four northern states Tilden carried: New York, Indiana, New Jersey, and Connecticut. Hayes took Ohio and the Midwest, except Indiana, but Tilden took New York, and his overwhelming margins in the white South garnered him roughly 250,000 more votes than Hayes. On the election day, November 7, 1876, the Democrats appeared to come out on top, winning the swing states of Connecticut, Indiana, New York, and New Jersey. Democrats agreed that Rutherford B. Hayes would become president in exchange for the withdrawal of federal troops from the South and grant them home rule. In the compromise, Southern Democrats agreed not to block the vote by which Congress awarded the contested electoral votes to Rutherford B. Hayes, and Hayes therefore became president. Republicans agreed to withdraw federal troops from actively intervening in the policies of Louisiana and South Carolina, the last two states occupied by federal troops. African Americans were trying to live out the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, which was equal protection, being full citizens, and exercising their right to vote. An electoral commission was set up to decide the outcome, which was made up of senators and representatives of the states. Immediately after the presidential election of 1876, it became clear that the outcome of the election raised largely on disputed returns from Florida, Louisiana, and South Carolina, the only three states with the Reconstruction-era Republican government still in power. Hayes oversaw the end of Reconstruction, began the efforts that led to civil service reform, and attempted to reconcile the divisions left over from the Civil War. The Compromise. In 1882, ex-slave Frederick Douglass probably put it the best way when he wrote, "Though slavery was abolished, the wrongs of my people were not ended. Though they were slaves, they were not yet quite free. No man can truly be free whose liberty is dependent upon the thoughts, feelings, and actions of others, and who has himself no means in his own hands for guarding, protecting, defending, and maintaining that liberty. He was free from the individual master, but a slave of society." The end of Reconstruction returned control to the government in the South to the white Southerners who promptly disenfranchised African Americans. The first part of the Compromise of 1877 is that the Union troops be ordered to go home and for Reconstruction be ended. The second part of the Compromise of 1877 was that the South wanted someone in their administration, and they ended up with David McKendree as the Postmaster General. The third part of the Compromise of 1877 was that the South wanted some type of industrialization down south. They wanted some money for a train and a railroad, but failed. Ongoing violence in the South, along with increasing conservatism in the North, resulted in the Compromise of 1877, usually viewed as the end of Reconstruction and a prelude to Jim Crow. Republican leaders agreed to end military oversight of the former Confederate states. Reconstruction was a success. It restored the United States as a unified nation. All of the former Confederate states had drafted new constitutions and acknowledged the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. They pledged their loyalty to the U.S. government. The Ku Klux Klan began to dominate the South. They would terrorize, intimidate, and threaten African Americans. They often went unprosecuted because they were tied to the Democratic Party, and the Democrats controlled the Southern policies after Reconstruction ended. The ending of Reconstruction was a huge blow to the former slaves as things got really bad for them after Reconstruction ended. The Compromise of 1877 had a major effect on former African Americans. Once Reconstruction ended, the federal troops left the South. Many white Southerners got elected to office. This led to many laws being passed that took away the rights for the former slaves and separated the races. The South passed laws called Jim Crow laws that segregated the South. There were separate bathrooms, seating sections on train cars, separate schools, and more. People had to pass a literacy test or pay a tax toll in order to be able to vote. The major victims from this electoral race weren't Tilden and his supporters, but the Southern Republicans, especially blacks, whose constitutional and political rights were traded away as part of the presidential bargain. It wasn't until 1883 that people took a stand and called for equal rights and accommodations in public places and prohibited jury discrimination. There are very controversial cases because of the content and that black people who had only been freed for about 20 years. The Compromise of 1877 affects us today because of the cheating that happened, which caused law enforcement to become involved and cause an investigation. Another way it affected us, in a good way, was Reconstruction ending, even though it wasn't so good for the African Americans after Reconstruction ended because of the Jim Crow laws being put into place. The North and South got what they wanted. The North got their president, and then the South, Reconstruction ended.